There's something strange that happens right before a person truly changes. They don't feel ready. They don't feel inspired. They don't receive some quiet epiphany that rearranges everything into sudden, beautiful clarity. They feel like a stranger in a room they've lived in for years. The walls are familiar. The routine is familiar. The people around them are familiar. But they, somewhere beneath all of it, are no longer the same person who built this life. And they can feel it. The way you feel a season changing before the temperature actually drops. Something is ending, and something else hasn't started yet. Most people, when they feel this, do one thing instinctively. They redecorate. New habits, new goals, new aesthetics. They rearrange the furniture of their life, hoping the room will start to feel like home again. And for a while, it almost works. But the feeling returns, quieter sometimes, more persistent, always. Because you cannot redecorate your way out of a room you've outgrown. Psychology says the only real move, the one most people are too afraid to make, is to walk through the door. Maybe you felt exactly this. Not a crisis, not a breakdown. Something subtler, and in many ways harder. Because subtlety doesn't justify the disruption, and you can't explain it to anyone without sounding ungrateful. Your life from the outside looks fine. Maybe it looks good. But from the inside, something has quietly stopped fitting. Like wearing a coat that was once perfectly tailored and realizing one morning that it's tight across the shoulders. And you can't remember when that happened, or who you were when it still felt right. You're still showing up, still maintaining the shape of your days, still performing the version of yourself that other people have come to expect. But underneath all of that performance, something is shifting, and the effort of holding it still is becoming exhausting. You become restless in spaces that once felt safe. You grow distant in conversations that used to satisfy you. You catch yourself going through the motions of your own life and feeling somewhere beneath the motion like a quiet observer watching someone else. Most people call this a phase. They call it burnout. They call it ingratitude and push it down and wait for it to resolve itself. But it doesn't resolve. It waits. And the longer you avoid it, the more space it takes up. Psychologists have noticed that this restlessness is rarely random. It isn't a malfunction of your mind or a weakness of your character. From a psychological perspective, what you're experiencing is what researchers call identity disruption. The internal friction that emerges when the self you have constructed no longer aligns with the self you are quietly, persistently becoming. Carl Jung described it as the tension between the persona, the version of you that was built to function in the world, to be acceptable, to belong, and the deeper self beneath it, which grows slowly and doesn't ask for permission.
Erik Erikson's work showed us that human beings don't simply have an identity the way they have a name. They build one, layer by layer, through experience, through loss, through the stories they absorb about who they are and what they deserve. And here is the part that changes everything. Most of those stories were written before you were old enough to question them. Research in developmental psychology consistently shows that our core beliefs about our worth, our limits, our lovability, they were shaped in our earliest years. Not chosen, absorbed, from caregivers, from wounds, from the subtle, repeated messages that told a very young version of you what kind of person you were allowed to be. Self-transformation, then, is not simply about building better habits or thinking more positively. It is about confronting an identity that was constructed without your full consent and deciding consciously which parts of it are actually yours. And here is the first hard truth about all of this. Most people never do that confrontation. Not fully. Not because they lack the desire, not because they don't feel the pull towards something more honest, but because the moment transformation begins to cost something real, a relationship, a self-image, a story they've been telling about why they are the way they are, they turn back. They return to the room, back to the life that doesn't fit. Because at least they know its dimensions. At least it asks nothing new of them. Familiarity, in the psychology of human behavior, is one of the most powerful forces on earth. More powerful, in most moments, than the desire to grow. And until you understand that, really understand it in your own life, transformation will keep arriving at the same door and finding it locked. Living inside the space between who you were and who you're becoming is a particular kind of exhaustion. It doesn't announce itself dramatically. It settles in like low-grade weather, a persistent heaviness that you can't fully explain to others, because from the outside, nothing appears to be wrong. And there is a grief in this that almost no one talks about. Because real transformation isn't just about gaining something new, it's about releasing something old. A version of yourself that kept you safe, that made sense for a time, that you built carefully and defended faithfully because it was the only architecture you knew. Even when that version of you was painful to inhabit, even when it kept you small, kept you silent, kept you in rooms you deserved to leave, it was known. And the human mind, above almost everything else, will choose the known. This is not a flaw. It is how the mind protects what it believes is still at risk. But at some point, the protection becomes the prison. And learning to tell the difference, that is where transformation actually begins. Here is what most conversations about self-improvement quietly get wrong. They position the old self as the enemy, something broken to be fixed, something weak and shameful to outrun as fast as possible, replaced with someone better, someone disciplined, someone finally worthy of the life they want. But psychology reveals a far more compassionate and ultimately more accurate truth. The patterns you most want to change, the walls, the deflections, the self-sabotage, the ways you contract around certain kinds of pain, were never signs of weakness. They were signs of intelligence. Specifically, the intelligence of a younger version of you, working with everything it had to survive a world that felt unpredictable or unsafe or emotionally unreliable. The part of you that learned not to need too much. The part that perfected invisibility. The part that over-explained or over-apologized or made itself endlessly agreeable to avoid conflict. That part was not broken. It was doing exactly what it was built to do. Psychologists call this adaptive behavior, and recognizing it, truly recognizing it without judgment, fundamentally changes the relationship you have with yourself. Because you cannot transform what you are at war with. You can only transform what you are willing to understand. But here is the paradox, sitting at the very center of self-transformation. The harder you try to force yourself to change, the more tightly the old patterns hold on. The strange part is that resistance isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign that your nervous system is doing its job. Neuroscience shows us that the brain cannot fully distinguish between familiar pain and familiar safety. If a certain kind of suffering has been your emotional baseline long enough, your system will unconsciously interpret it as home, and anything that threatens to disrupt it, even something healing, will trigger an alarm. This is why the person who wants to stop over-apologizing keeps apologizing. Why the person who swears they're done shrinking
keeps shrinking. Why intentions collapse at the exact moment they're needed most. Willpower alone has never been, and will never be, enough. Real transformation requires something slower and harder than force. It requires the willingness to sit with yourself in genuine honesty and ask, what was I originally protecting? Is that threat still real? And what would I allow myself to become if the answer was no? And here is what almost no one prepares you for. When you begin to genuinely change, not perform change, not talk about it, but actually inhabit a different version of yourself, some people in your life will resist it before you've even fully understood it yourself. Not because they want you to stay miserable, but because your growth disturbs a balance they relied on. Your smallness felt like loyalty to them. Your limitations made their own feel more comfortable. The room you're outgrowing was also, for certain people, a room they built around you. And when you start moving toward the door, they will pull. Sometimes gently, sometimes with guilt, sometimes with a silence that says more than words. The pull will feel like love. Sometimes it is love, tangled up with fear. Learning to tell the difference, to honor the love while still walking through the door, is one of the most quietly courageous things a human being can do. Have you ever noticed that the version of yourself you most want to become already exists somewhere inside you? Not as a fantasy, not as an aspirational image you're chasing, but as a quiet, persistent knowing. A recognition, even when you can't fully articulate it, of what feels true and what doesn't, of what you are building toward and what you have spent years carefully, exhaustingly building around. You felt it in the conversation where you said exactly what you meant without softening it, and it felt like relief. In the decision where you trusted your own instinct over someone else's expectation and felt, just for a moment, more like yourself than you had in years. Those moments weren't accidents. They were the person you're becoming, breaking through the surface of the person you've learned to perform. Here is what I want you to hold on to when this all feels like too much. You are not behind. You are not someone who keeps failing to become who they were supposed to be. You are someone in the middle of something, real and difficult and worthwhile. And the middle is always the hardest part, because it demands that you let go of what you know before you can fully see what's waiting. The discomfort you feel is not proof that something is wrong with you. It is proof that something in you is alive enough to want more. Honest enough to admit that the room you've been living in, the identity you've been maintaining, no longer holds the full truth of who you are. And that is not a crisis. That is the beginning of something. Transformation does not ask you to become someone unrecognizable. It asks you to become more honestly, more completely, more courageously yourself. Stripped of what was never yours to carry, the fear that was handed to you before you knew what fear was, the unworthiness that was absorbed, not chosen, the smallness that was a strategy, not a truth. You were never the room. You were always the person standing inside it. The most significant transformation you will ever go through is not the one that changes your circumstances. It is the one that changes how you see yourself when no one else is watching. The old version of you did not fail you. It carried you through whatever it had to until it brought you here, to this exact threshold,
to this moment of recognizing that the room you built for survival was never meant to be your permanent address. You were always meant to outgrow it. Not with force, not with self-contempt, not by running, but by finally, quietly, choosing to stop squeezing yourself back through a door that no longer fits. The person on the other side isn't a stranger. They've been waiting. They're just more honest than the version you've been presenting to the world.